So here's a look at what we're about to make together. It's this 70s title that scrolls through the whole rainbow. Feels very, I don't know, Guardians of the Galaxy. There's no plugins involved. I've used 2 pieces of stock footage, but that's completely optional. You can get this done really quickly. Let me show you how. Let's dive in. So as always, we're going to start with a new composition. I might just go full 4K for this one. Okay, let's add some text. I'm going to call this Colorama because that's the effect we're going to be using in a minute. I'm going to go all caps. I've picked ITC Avant-Garde, which is a part of the Adobe font library. And it's free, which is nice. And it's kind of got that 70s vibe. I'm just gonna put that in the center using the align tool. So this font has a couple of extra glyphs which I wanna get at. You can't change glyphs inside of After Effects to my knowledge. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to hit copy, jump into Illustrator and hit paste. And then when I select the A, I can kind of hover over and slant them like this. And that looks much cooler in my opinion. So now I'm just going to copy that, head back, paste it, boom. All right, so far so good. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Grant M. Fletcher, and if you can't even be bothered going through the rest of this tutorial, you can actually buy this title as well as 29 other titles and a whole lot of other great nostalgic goodies with our new pack, Nostalgia. So the first effect we're going to add is a drop shadow. We can't see it right now actually, so maybe I'm just going to make a new solid just in a random color just so you can see what's going on to start with. So we're going to go 100% opacity. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit there. That actually already looks kind of like a 70s film, hey? And I'm going to put this directly underneath it. So that's 180 in direction. So I'm going to change that distance to maybe 15, you know, you can go 20, 25, it doesn't really matter, it's whatever you think looks good. And then I'm actually just going to duplicate that. And the great thing about it is it doesn't start from the white text, the next duplication distance will start from this drop shadow. So when I duplicate it, it just jumps down and down and down. So you can already kind of see this look starting to form. I mean, even that looks cool in terms of like some sort of fake 3D. So I want, yeah, let's just stick with 5 drop shadows for now. At this stage, you could start picking any color you wanted, and be very specific about it. And then, you know, you could use a hue wheel to kind of scroll these around, but that's not the way I want to do it. I want a little bit more control. I want to have a little bit more of a play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change these shadow colors. So let's jump in here, you know, say it was red as a default in yours. I'm going to go to 0 for the reds. So it's just black or just white. And I'm going to add, say 20. So now it's just 20% gray. So the first one is full black and the next one's 20% gray. And I want to add 20% every time. Now 20 is a very easy number to add 20, you know, 40 and so on. But inside of After Effects, you can also do math. So if I just go 20 plus 20 and hit enter, it's going to do it for me and jump straight to 40. So if you're ever doing a bit more of a weird increment, just do that. And so now we have this gradient from a light gray to a black. You can go all the way from black to white, and that will give you a certain look, but this is the way I'm doing it, and you'll see later why that is. So now we've got these drop shadows, but we want to add some color. So I'm going to use an effect that I absolutely love, which comes in After Effects called Colorama. Wow. That was a punch in the face. So now we can change these colors under output cycle to anything we want. So this is just the default. It's actually the hue cycle that comes up straight away. That's actually the one we're going to use, but you can completely customize these colors. There's also a whole lot of presets in here. Fire is pretty cool. You know, that looks good already. Like, how 70s is that? Those earth tones, how delicious Kanye colors, as it were, very 70s. And there's some in here that are really crazy, like Caribbean has a million in there. Caribbean or Caribbean? Weigh in the comments below. And so a lot of these are like, if you look at here, it just reminds you of like Windows 98 or something. So yes, most of these aren't super useful. But then there's simple ones like just a ramp red. And you can drag these colors around anywhere you want to give you a different look. And what they're doing is that it is mapping in the input phase up here, it's mapping the intensity, the black to white. And since there's no white here, it's not going to go all the way through the hue cycle from black to white. So often I'll make something black and white just so I can mess with it afterwards. So we can make decisions on, you know, pretty much any color we want. So let's go, you know, a bright pink, and then, you know, to a red, or like, hey, let's add some sort of seafoam green or something. Now we've got this kind of ugly color that I don't like in here. What I can do is I can turn off interpolate palette, which is going to mean that there's none of this ramping between the colors. So if I had a RGB palette, for example, and I had that off, it's just that. And if I turn it back on, you can see we're getting the purple and we're getting kind of these in-between colors. So that can give you some really cool looks. So let's change that from RGB to the hue cycle. And then cycle repetitions is something that's fun to play with as well. If I go cycle 3 times, you're just going to see those colors come around quicker in the cycle. We are going to want to animate this phase shift. So I'm going to throw a keyframe there. I just hit U to show me any keyframes that I have on this layer. It's one of my favorite shortcuts. And then I'm going to go to the end and just maybe say, do a full cycle for me, 1. So now when you play that back, it's kind of slowly phasing through those colors. Now that you've seen how that looks, you can kind of make some tweaks. But before we do, I want this top layer, which is white, I want that to stay white. And obviously you can just duplicate this layer and have a white layer on top of it. You can duplicate the layer and put a gradient or something cool like that on it. But what I want to do is I want to use an effect called CC Composite. See, there you go, it's white. That was weird, Grant. How'd you do that? So CC Composite is really useful, and what it's doing is it's pretty much making a copy of the layer on top of all of this. It can be used for a lot of great things when it comes to masking, and it gives you the ability to then use blending modes on top of all these effects that you've got underneath. And so then you can make more stylistic decisions, like because I'm going for a bit of a 70s vibe, I'm pulling these curves below the composite so the composite stays white. I think it's a bit too bright. I want it to be a bit darker so you can, you know, a bit more contrast to the white on top. So I can just kind of pull down the curves there. You could also decide to change maybe the saturation of it to make it a little bit more desaturated. I think I'm actually going to do that in an adjustment layer, so I'm going to just delete that. So I decided to add another drop shadow, a 6th drop shadow there, and change the distance between them to 25 to change that up a little bit. But now you can kind of see that phasing through of the colors there. And yeah, like I said, you can tweak to your heart's content. It doesn't have to go through the whole rainbow like I've got here. It could just go through 3 colors or 4 colors. You can be real creative. But let's go from here to finessing it to make it look even more 70s retro and vintage. So one of the things that are the most important, in my opinion, with making stuff look a little bit retro tends to be glow. You can do glow in a number of ways. There is an After Effects plugin called Glow. It's really bad, I'm not gonna lie. So another way that I tend to do is use a plugin called Deep Glow, which I would really recommend. It gives you really great glows straight out of the box. And you know, the tweaking is really good and easy. But for this, let's build our own glow. Let's show After Effects how it really should be done. You know what? Let me just show you how bad the After Effects glow is. Now the reason why this, you hear me saying this glow is bad, is that it's just kind of like one big block. It doesn't fall off. So let's just build our own glow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-comp this. So I'm going to call it PC because that's what I name all my pre-comps, PC. And we're going to call it title, if I could spell. So this is what we're going to use to stack up a glow using blurs. So I'm going to start by duplicating that layer, and then we're going to grab ourselves a blur. All the blurs do different things. For this case, I'm going to use the Fastbox blur, which, believe it or not, is actually slower than the Gaussian blur or Gaussian blur. I think it's meant to be pronounced Gaussian, but I always say Gaussian and people have a go at me. So we're going to use Fastbox blur, and then we are going to end up using a blending mode on it. Can you see it already starts to look really quite good, but you know, the throw isn't very far, or the reach. See, and then if we blow it out, it doesn't look like it falls off, it just looks like it ends. And that's why we're going to duplicate it multiple times. You're going to want to tweak the amount of glow, because you know, your glow should be kind of a bit subtle. It shouldn't be too hectic. We're going to go from 20 to 60 blur radius for this one. So now you can kind of see that glow looks like it's just extended itself. And then for maybe a third one here, we're going to go with, let's say, 100. We could be less lazy and do these at a more normal iteration, you know, maybe 20, 40, 60, 80, that kind of thing. But I'm just going to make 3 in this case. So like, that's really subtle. But if I kind of turn these off, you can see it. It is there, and it's just kind of blurring it out. And you can decide how crazy you want to go with it, how much of a statement you want to make. But I tend to find with this stuff that even though we're doing something quite bombastic, subtlety is still key. It's a really hard balance to find when you're doing retro titles, to not just lump one thing on there. So I'm going to rename these to maybe Glow 1, Glow 2, and Glow 3. And I'll rename this to main title just because. We don't need that anymore. Let's make a new solid, make it black, and that'll be our background. So let's start furthering this look. We're going to add a new adjustment layer, and we're going to add another blur, I guess. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to blur it and then sharpen it. You'll find that with old film stock, there's not as much detail and sharpness to edges as you would get in a digital image. So I'm going to add sharpen, and another one you can use is unsharp mask. I guess it's got a lot more control. I'm just going to use sharpen in this case. So if we maybe take sharpen to say 150 and then start backing off this blur to maybe 2. See, that's already looking a lot more realistic. We could go even further back if we want there to be a bit more clarity to 1.5. Now, all of these things have been subtle, but let's remember, solo that's what it looked like. This is how milky and smooth it's looking now. Doesn't that already feel better to you and more vintage, more realistic? One problem I'm having with this is that is really saturated, especially in the red. So I might use a tint effect to kind of bring that back a bit, and just, you know, like maybe 10, maybe 20% on there. See, that's already starting to look better. Still feels a little bit digital to me, maybe a few too many frames per second. So I'm going to use posterized time, which is just something that allows you to decide the frame rate even if you already have it set from the composition level, and kind of cut that in half to 12 frames. The reason I want it to be a bit more jittery is that most of these graphics back in the day were done stop motion wise before they had something like Scanimate, where they were using an actual machine and then refilming it in. That's also the reason for all of the glows, by the way, is that often these things would be filmed or refilmed for a lot of the, especially the stuff that was made digitally, was actually then put back into a film camera or a TV camera. So in this case, I'm going lower frame rate because I'm assuming that someone did this in stop motion somehow, or that it got slowed down at some point, but the posterized time really helps to sell it. I think we need a bit more movement. Now I'm going to make maybe a new null object. I'm going to pick whip the glows and the main title to that null object. I can also parent the glows to the main title. I'm going to call this movement. And then I'm going to hit P to scroll down just my position. I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch to open the expressions for the position. And I'm going to type wiggle. It gives you a little prompt, which is nice. First number is the times, the second number is the amount. So I'm just going to start with 2, 3 and see how that feels. So now you can see a little bit of that jitter. Usually I would actually make 2 different movements. One that's up and down, which would happen a lot in the film canister, and the other would be this kind of moving all sides. But yeah, that wiggle position there is just having it move around a little bit like this, which is great. But again, it's still too digital. Let's add a flicker. One way to add a flicker is to add a solid. I don't like to make a new solid for everything I do. I'm really doing it for you guys. I would usually just reuse the same solid for everything. Did you know, for example, that a solid and an adjustment layer are exactly the same thing? You just hit this little button and now that solid is an adjustment layer. So I tend to keep my projects pretty clean by only having one solid per size aspect ratio. But in this case, I want a black solid. I'm going to call this flicker, and then I'm going to bring the opacity down to 0. I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch. I'm going to use a wiggle again, maybe like 10 times, and the amount being 3, and then we will watch that back. All right, that's happening. Wow, it's really subtle though, so you know, maybe you want to up that a little bit, but it's still looking good. I feel like this black is too black, the background. So let's get a gradient ramp going. I'm going to make it radial so it's circular, and I move the center down to the middle of the comp. I might move this outside out to the edge here. And then we are going to go from black is fine. And then the inside, maybe like a really subtle kind of like purple. And I'm just going to simply swap those colors around. That's already looking better. I mean, that black is still a little bit too much. It's too digital. The dynamic range wouldn't be as good. So I'm going to go gray there and maybe a little bit more darker and desaturated on this purple over here. So that's looking pretty good. What you're going to start to notice in After Effects is a little bit of this banding. I don't know if you can see it, but I definitely can. One thing we can do is make sure that instead of in 8 bits per channel, we're in 16 or 32 bit. So I'm going to go to 16, and that's actually gotten rid of most of that. But it might still happen, especially if you're rendering out as a H.264. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to fix that by using noise. So it's like a digital substitute for grain. I've got my adjustment layer, and like I said, when you drag an adjustment layer in, it is a solid if you're not making it from scratch. So I just click on that button, and hey, it's an adjustment layer again. Let's call this noise. I'm going to find the effect noise, and I'm going to maybe put in, 3% noise. I don't want it to be in color, I want it to be monochromatic. And if you don't have like stock grains and that kind of thing, which for this project, I highly recommend getting some of Ez Cohen's stock grains. If you don't have that, then something like noise is a useful substitute. I would not go nude or naked in terms of grain and noise on this. But even if you do have some of those things, what happens is all these little granules of grain, they force the H.264 to export every pixel that has changed. That's what a H.264 is doing, is it's only rendering out the pixels that have changed. Otherwise, it's keeping the pixel the same. So in this case, you could end up with some real bad banding, but because it's constantly changing, this will really help. You could totally get away with more blur on this, so maybe give that a go. But the other thing that I would definitely recommend is, like I said before, maybe the 16mm texture from Ez Cohen. There's a bunch of those. They're really great. So you're going to want to use a blending mode here. I'm going to use lighten in this case, and it's going to show up with all this craziness. You're going to want to back off the opacity of it, sure, but it's still giving me all that color noise, and I might not want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tint this. It's probably sacrilege to someone who really knows about film stock, but I'm going to tint that. I'm also going to open up a levels effect, and I'm going all this white here. I don't really want that, but I do want these bigger chunks here, these like really nice big chunky ones. So I'm going to push this midpoint, this gamma, in this direction. And so now I'm just kind of more left with those little bits there. And hey, how about some extra sacrilege? Let's add 35mm grain and 16mm grain together. Sometimes what's happened is that they've filmed the title sequence in 16mm onto film in their studio, and then the movie itself is in 35 when it gets printed. And so you can get away with doing both sometimes without getting into too much trouble. I'm going to use an overlay here, and again, maybe subtlety is the key. Let's go with 40% and 40%, though it could be more subtle. That's probably going to do the trick. So before we finish this off, let's just look at where we're at. A little bit of shake, a little bit of jitter, a little bit of grain, a little bit of noise. What did we come from? Oh yeah, this digital thing that doesn't move at all. So you can see how this finessing is just really helping to sell it. And there's so much tweaking that you can do until you find that it's just right. The only other thing that I've got in the templated version, which we can look over here, looks pretty much the same, is that I've got this grit layer before the effects, which is like a fractal noise layer. Just the dark bits are set to multiply, giving it a little bit more inconsistency in how white it is. Again, like that is a very digital trait of just having a color look exactly the same throughout the whole frame. So there's a fractal noise on there with a little bit of blur with the evolution animated. And if you really want to check that out, why not buy Nostalgia? Well, thanks so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. I've got more videos coming soon. And until then, just remember that Jesus loves you. Yes, even you. You are not the exception.